Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. I'm very happy to see some faces that I haven't seen in a long time. So thank you for that. And that means that you're interested in what we have to say. So I will give you a short introduction in front of the Network for Ecohealth and One Health. And then you will have this time a little bit different webinar about our book. It will not be just a simple description of the chapters. It will be an interactive talk. So we shall see how this goes. So feel free, be open-minded, and feel free to jump in, to ask, to communicate, to interact, because that's what we need this time from you, especially. And okay, try to share, right? Can you see it?
Yep.
Yes.
Is it in presenting mode? Does it move?
It's moving
Oh,
fine. Very good.
okay, so this time it's working. Fantastic. Okay, let's start, not to waste any more time. So today we have Glen and Barry with us, who will talk about our book. And our book is Principles of One Health for a Better Planet. And this is one of the webinars that is intended for promotion of our book, and like little teasers to make you want to read the book, even though maybe some of you have already seen it and read probably some parts of it. Just a few words who we are. The book has started as an idea from one of the ladies here called Asta. And we, in a Network for Ecohealth and One Health, decided to write a textbook on One Health, which is meant for either students or experts who are very new in One Health. So it's a basic textbook. If you're interested, you can read on our website about our activities, about everything related to NEO. And you can also join us. There is a form that you can fill and join us. For the moment, the membership is still free. There will be some annual membership decided further on, but for the moment, it is still free. Now, the book is structured around the One Health competences, which are described in a publication that we did, I think, 2 years ago. And that was somehow the start of all this. No, maybe more, a few years ago. And that was somehow the start of everything. And that is something that we also promote in the book. In the book, every chapter is for developing one of the competencies. As you can see, we will not go through the table, but as you can see, every chapter covers several competencies that you can gain while reading the book. This is not a bedtime story book. This is a learning book. So you need to have your mind sharpened when you go through the book, and you will see why in a moment. There is also a glossary at the end of the book, which describes some main terms that we thought were important to be explained, so that we're on the same page when we talk about some expressions. In the book, there are some icons that are related to, for instance, the one you can see is for key terms. So the purple one is for key terms, and those are the terms that are important words or phrases that are highlighted with the main text in the textbook. Then there are icons for a key concept, which refers to essential idea, theory, or principle, which is important for understanding the topic. There is also differences. For example, from chapter 1, there are differences in how different disciplines are practitioners conceptualize health and so on. So you can read about a key concept. Then there is stuff like activity. That is why you have to be really awake and look for the activities. There are several learning questions, exercises, or intermissions that you have to look into. Then you have questions. For some questions, there are not right or wrong answers. It is just something that you will gain through the book or gain through your practice, because our topics are somehow different. Then there are applied examples. You have examples from us that are shown in the book, and based on those examples, you can probably form your own example or answer when you see how we resolved some of the questions. And that's it. We go back to Barry and Glenn. So, guys, are you ready? Barry will be, oh, sorry, I went out of the, sorry. So they will present themselves, but Barry comes from the UCD School of Agriculture and Food University College from Dublin, and Glenn comes from the Royal School of Veterinary Studies in Edinburgh. So, guys, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you, Sarah. Barry, would you like to start? Do you want to?
Well, I think you have the floor at the moment, Glenn,
I
so
have
it'd
the
be rude to
floor.
take it off you.
Oh, I don't know. How should we play this?
Well, we said we give a little bit of structure in terms of aims and how it fits into One Health. So what's your chapter about?
Yes. And I guess we can probably relate that to our own disciplinary backgrounds and where we're actually coming from within our chapters. So where we've written them from, where our engagement with One Health is taking us. So my own background is very interdisciplinary, quite radically so, in the sense that sort of over 25 years ago, I was a wildlife vet, and then retrained in educational science, educational research, but did my PhD in animal geographies. And I think I'm used to working across the academy. So I've been in every college within the university. And I'm quite comfortable working across the arts, humanities, and sciences. And my research was very much about the potential for multi-species dialogue. So understanding what will allow us to move from debate into dialogue, which I feel is a generative field that we haven't realized, particularly in the biomedical disciplines, because unlike social science and physics, the biomedical disciplines haven't really engaged with the quantum turn, so they haven't brought reflexivity into their ways of working, and so a lot of my teaching has been around bringing first and fourth person ways of knowing into learning, into education, and that really, I guess, is a key part of Buddhist thinking. I think Thich Nhat Hanh's been a really great advocate of turning to ourselves in order to solve the problems that we face. And I'm quite convinced that is where we will literally be able to create the new from. So I'm not a great fan of problem solving, because I think we actually can sidestep some of the problems and actually create the new in many instances, and allow the old to become redundant. But that requires very particular spaces to be created in which it's safe to do that. More often than not, we don't have those spaces. We don't have prototyping spaces. So I guess that's kind of all feeding into the chapter, and the chapter is very much looking at the development of awareness, of reflexivity, the integration of reflexivity through practice into our approaches, with a view to radically transforming our approaches. And then whatever it is we're approaching out there becomes different because we approach it differently. So I think when I think of Arness's approach to his mountain cabin, his ecozophy tea, was so radical because he approached his cabin a different way every single time he approached his cabin. And so for me, the approach is very, very important. And we can then integrate that into collaborative work. So we can integrate it into communities of practice. And I see this happening a lot in learning for sustainability, for example, and in quite a number of other areas. And I guess that's what I've tried to contribute to this particular book. And I'm keen to explore it, particularly in the face of different challenges. And Barry, you work a lot on ecological challenges, so I think I can bring you in and kind of invite you to sort of say a little bit about your background.
Yeah. And then you could maybe talk about some of this, how I suppose the competencies that you delve into in your chapter can be, I mean, I don't even want to say harnessed, because I think that's almost like a not the correct word, but how they can be brought
Barry,
to bear.
can I pick you up on that? Because that is you've just given the perfect example. The language we use in certain disciplines is like 50 years out of date. We talk about management, we talk about control, and these are terms that reflect a particular relationship with the world that is the problem. So as soon as we talk about harnessing, it has a colonial connotation, and for me there needs to be a language turn as part of a number of other terms where we're really careful about the verbs that we use. And I'm gonna pass this straight back to you, Barry, because you don't use English in your everyday necessarily. I'm sure you're.
Oh, well, that's probably a conversation for another day in some respects. No, I do, but I know from the language that you're using that some of the language that I use mightn't necessarily fit into with the philosophical approaches that you have towards creating the new, if you want. I'm not going to call it problem solving, I'm calling it creating the new. Because what I deal with and what I have been dealing with, so I'm an agricultural ecologist who works mainly on dealing with the decline of biodiversity in agricultural ecosystems. So that's where my feet are buried, but it's always been there's always been an element of multidisciplinary, because the people who are in the floor below me are all productionists, and they think differently to the way that we do on this floor, because we're basically agroecologists. And then through that sort of interface, if you like, then I got into the idea of how biodiversity is creating or being a source of these new diseases. So, and we know this, but this, and I'll get back to the framing of that in a second. So what I tried to do in the chapter was to talk about biological resources from a human perspective and why they're important, and that terminology is around ecosystem services. Specifically, we don't have food systems without biological resources, so that's one example of why they're important. And then it was almost like a training exercise to show how this approach can be used for systems thinking and for transdisciplinarity. Because almost from every piece of research that I've started, I've always had at least a foot in one camp, be it production or be it conservation or even, dare I say the dirty word, management. But that type of approach. So, and the really tricky one that's been framed over the last 20 years, and we still have it, is the framing of biodiversity as a source of diseases. Whereas that's not the case at all. It's the way in which humans interact in their environments that creates a situation which diseases are spilling over either to domestic animals or to wild animals. And then why that's important to One Health, well, I'd almost say, how is that not related to One Health? Tell me any element of that isn't related to the One Health paradigm. It's probably less obvious in some respects in relation to the plant health element, but certainly, again, if I be so bold as to go back to the original NEO book, Marie and our co-authors in chapter 5, we put together this diagram and it totally relates to how humans interact with the ecosystem services that could be potentially given or could potentially taken out of a lump of land. I often do this with students, and I say, imagine someone gives you 100 acres. What do you want to do with it? You can produce food, you can produce forestry, you can produce biodiversity, you can regulate diseases, you can regulate water, you can regulate climate, and all of these things are totally part of the One Health paradigm along one sort of along any aspect of it. So that's how I feel the initial part of the chapter that I was involved in with, sorry, I should say with multiple co-authors, by the way, who, unlike yourself, Glenn, you soldiered on your own. I had too many people to mention, but they know who they are. Um, so it was really a sort of a collective effort, but those are the sort of the ideas that we tried to get across.
I just want to pick up on one or two really key points there. So I think you described very clearly the attitude towards biodiversity that that you were concerned about, that used to exist, where biodiversity was seen as a source of diseases. And for me, that attitude is an example of a fear-based orientation that leads to othering. And I think othering is something we're seeing a lot in the world right now, and that is a concern, within human society, but also within more than human societies. And I think it's one of the reasons why a very careful attention, and when I say careful, I'm hyphenating care and full with two L's on full. A caring practice will actually identify these attitudinal elements, which for me are at the frontier of the new science. A bias for me is one of the frontiers of the sciences generally need to be exploring, so that we're able to operate from a place of integration. And that's why the word integration features in my chapter. For me, integration is a neurobiological premise, and it involves actually us asking ourselves, whether we are present to the world. And if fear is in the mix, if we're seeing everything as a threat, it's a sign that there's only part of our brain that's actually being engaged. And it's the part of the brain that historically has served very useful purposes, but also filters things. If we're at our best, we've got to be aware of these filters, because they lead to a myopic vision, and they're part of that same reductive approach, really. So I think that was something really key, I guess, in what you were framing there. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I think what you're talking about is developing a greater literacy, and whether we're talking about this in terms of biodiversity literacy or ecological literacy. And the parallel for me, when we bring ourselves in as relational organisms, is that we can become literate within our own knowledge systems. So I think last time we spoke, I was talking about the need for vertical literacy, where head, heart, hand intelligences are integrated. And again, that's another form of literacy that I think will become very key within One Health, as we seek to become more proficient in understanding what it is we're faced with, and how we're related to these very complex systems, actually.
I think there's something really, I mean, okay, when I started off in One Health, back like almost at the end of the noughties, when it had just sort of kicked off, I was quite calculated, I would say, in my approach in relation to it, because I thought this was a way in which you could harness conservation, because this is a way in which you could create this literacy across multiple disciplines, like you're saying. And I think it still does that, and I think it's really blown it wide open in actual fact. When it's when it's explored in its, I would say, purest, truest sense, when people really go in to say, I want to find out how my system that I'm interested in, you know, be I someone who's interested in the cultivars of wheat. You know, I want to know how that's impacted by all the other realms that it could be impacted in, either on the front end or on the back end, and how that's totally related. I think the scope for One Health to have impact across actually, like what I sometimes call dramatically in bringing an end to ourselves, I think is really, really powerful, because it actually does show how vulnerable we are, because we are just, as you say, little, we are one of these sort of slots in that bigger system, you know? And again, this is sort of maybe more of a deep philosophical debate, in that, you know, potentially the world could go on without us, or it has existed without us before. So if we don't manage or whatever whatever term you want to say, if you're not aware of the fact that can't keep on doing what we're doing, or else we will engineer ourselves out of existence, that the planet will persist without us, but we won't be in it. You know, and this is a conversation that I try to have with people who are not in life sciences. They're not, you know, just ordinary individuals. And it's something that probably your skills are much more powerful at being able to actually get across that message in a way that isn't threatening, or that's engaging, rather than, as we talked about this before, the sort of the ultra rational approach of throwing all the figures at people and saying, if we keep doing what we're doing, we're going to bring an end to ourselves. Whereas if you explain the connectedness of a system, this might be a lot more impactful in terms of eliciting something that might be more positive into the future. So, but it's a
Um,
frustrating place to be in, I can tell you.
it's frustrating, but it's also a really great opportunity to be sitting in. And I just want to pick up on some of the threads that you've highlighted there. So when you talk about us being on the edge of this cliff, and really struggling to make sense of it, I think some of the language that Joanna Macy has brought to this. So she describes, you know, what we're faced as the great unraveling. And I think as soon as we as a species have disconnected ourselves from nature and tended to prioritize a grasping, apprehending, utilitarian mode, which then feeds actually into our sciences. It's a particular attentional mode. It just perpetuates that great unraveling, and then, you know, the imaginaries available to us are, as you say, you know, business as usual, which is probably going to start scaling up very, very quickly. And, you know, we just won't know how the dominoes will fall, but, you know, we might see the insurance sector collapsing as whole areas of the planet become literally uninsurable. We'll start seeing, you know, conflicts over all sorts of resources. We're seeing them now. The other imaginary, which is equally frightening, is the techno fix imaginary, where, you know, we think that there's a technical problem to be fixed, and we are the technicians to do the fixing. And both of those are deeply worrying, because they're part of, you know, the paradigm. They're part of, you know, the industrial Cartesian sort of approach to the world. And there's an approach that is much more relational, that is available to us if we prioritize the quality of our relationships and ways of relating. And there'll be a huge diversity to those as well. And within that, the vitality of life. I mean, this is the beauty. I mean, the way Joanna would have described that third imaginary, is it's a turning to life. And life is this beautiful mystery that we're gifted, that we take for granted. And it has a vitality, a creativity to it that is absolutely incredible. And so it's kind of a question for us to live into, I think, that you know, is there, will continue to challenge us. I'd love to know what people like Rachel Carson would be saying now, you know, looking at how much progress we've made since they, you know, very clearly laid out what was happening, you know, however many, 70 years ago, probably slightly more than that. Yeah, there's some very big questions happening there, and lots of cause for hope. I mean, there's a debate coming up in the UK Parliament on fiduciary duty for pensions funds, and it will actually challenge our elected representatives to really think about whether all of our collective investment through the pension funds into you know, the various business enterprises across the world, whether they actually have a fiduciary duty to future generations, to the planet. And you know, that could be a game changer. For example, I think today David Attenborough is actually trying to get a part of Northumberland bought up, you know, as because it's just become on the market. So there's things starting to happen around not just land ownership, but land stewardship. And I think that's central to One Health is, you know, what futures are we really here to bring into being to actually you know, help realize. So I've kind of started going off on a long rant.
I think it's like, because again, this is something that we chatted about before. So like, we as researchers, we sit at our desks, or we go out and we go into the field and we collect our data and we write our papers and all the rest. And I mean, not sure how many papers I've written, but I think possibly the most impactful thing I ever did was collaborate in this comic that we wrote about curlew. So I'm not taking away from academic rigor, because it actually came from that, but I'm just talking about in terms of actually on the front end of being impactful. So we've written this comic that's for children, about the plight of this endangered bird and how people got involved in it, and a very famous musician in Britain and Ireland, and he's hugely popular in Ireland, a guy called David Gray. For whatever reason, he made it big here before he made it big in his homeland, and he got in behind it, so we were able to sort of use his influence as well. But it's that sort of, I think it's the integration of these ideas, or the crossover, or the looking for something different in relation to bringing together the new facts that are becoming more and more difficult to actually deal with, because they're more and more stark each time. That's been my experience. So from the year when I started my undergraduate degree in 2000 or so, the data have become more and more stark. Even in places like Europe, where the Common Agricultural Policy has tried to do its best for agricultural biodiversity, it's still being blitzed. So and by that data there, so maybe it is processes like, or approaches like, softer ways, by getting children to nag their parents rather than going after the parents, if you like. That might be the more productive way to bring about behavior change, or whatever is needed to go off the course. And I know behavior change is one of your terms that you sort of
Well, I'm not a fan of behavior change only in the sense that behavior is very downstream. And, you know, there's that Desmond Tutu quote, you know, where he says, you know, if you keep rescuing a baby from the river, you know, at some point you've got to decide to go upstream. And for me, upstream is actually about the sources that we operate from, that our behavior then that translates into behavior. So we've got to be acting around our thoughts, around our attitudes, around our attentional practices. And for me, it's particularly attentional practices that precede behavior. Behavior actually looks after itself if we know how to attend to the world. And you were talking about young people. I think Barbara Hassler's just joined us, and she went to see Sammy Lee performing music with nightingales. And as you probably know, very well, Barry, the nightingale is one of our incredible songbirds who is very, very threatened, particularly in Northern Europe. And there's a fantastic piece of sociobiological collaboration dating back to the start of the last century, where a cellist discovered they could play music with the nightingale, and they would actually be improvising together, and actually being there to see just how collaborative nature can be with us when we are at our best, is magical. And if children take their parents to something like that, I'm not sure they need to do any nagging. It's kind of the joy comes through. There are positive energies, and we also move into modes of attention that are expansive. And I think as soon as we bring awe and wonder in, another expansive emotion is gratitude. If we're coming from gratitude, we start to recognize what's actually important. But it's, it requires a culture change where, we actually take time to praise, to identify what we're thankful for. So there's a lot of cultural shifts that are needed, I think, as part of this turning, as part of this One Health journey, where we recognize not just our interdependency, but our intradependency. Because I think there's an issue I have with the notion of a solo self that I think is limits us as well.
Yeah, like that. A lot of that. I mean, where I would have come with that interface, those ideas would be like from the Edmund Wilson approach, like in terms of so that's the biologist friendly translation, if you like, in terms of how this is so important to us. And I mean, like his argument is that there are genes in us, so there's genomic data to demonstrate that we love and need nature, which for whatever you say, well, as you said, I can't understand how it gets switched off, because I just can't. I could never understand it. So I'm probably not a good person to ask. So maybe I'm not a good person to go out and talk to the people in the street about this, because I'm just there going, are you blind or are you deaf? Can you not hear those birds? Can you not see these creatures? They're amazing. So, how can you let this happen? Even from a very, very young age, I struggled with that. So even though I spend now time in lecture theatres with productionists, talking to them about it, it does come out eventually. And you do have to demonstrate, patience and all this, all of these sort of, I mean, a lot of the competencies, like in terms of effective communication, which is effective communication is mainly about listening, as far as I'm concerned. So that's one of the aspects, is I mean, again, you might use a different set of terms, but how can we tap into the fact that those innate characteristics are there? Societally, we've numbed them. So how can we enable ourselves to save ourselves in some respects?
So I think my inspiration there, or the reasons I have hope, is that within learning for sustainability, so particularly for younger age groups, the emphasis on learning for flourishing takes a view of the whole person and the potentialities that those people carry that can be denied them, because if we just view them as somebody who's going to go into the marketplace and become productive, we're not developing them for life. We're developing for an economy that's failed. So there's a need to re-energize, like, the whole educational agenda, so that we're clearer internationally what futures we're preparing people for, and the hope for the future are the generations coming through who have clearly demonstrated that they don't think very much of the current generations who politically have failed them, who've made some very questionable decisions. So there's a lot of education there that's needed, and it will be looking across the board. It will have to address a number of different pandemics. So there's a pandemic of false information that we have to address, amongst others. And you can see I'm using pandemic in a very broad sense here. I view anything that travels and spreads as a pandemic, and that will be really key. And I think another thing that will be really key is the ability to slow down. And one of the things that I think you were probably getting at in terms of being in nature is we've got to take time. We've got to reclaim time and invest in quality time. And that's at some level we'll know is good for us, but most of us will probably end up having to have a little bit of a breakdown before we fully realize what's good for us. So there's a that's just one of a number of paradoxes we've got to wrestle with. We don't know what's good for us.
Yeah, it's just the one message that I got is there's a bunch of guys who I go running with who are from all different parts of the university. And I was out with them one day and I was explaining that on my kid's shoes, he's 2.5, it has on the bottom of them. So it's a message for the parent. It's not for the child because he's not going to be reading at 2.5. Even as gifted as he is, he's not going to be reading at that age, right? It says, you're the last generation that can save the planet. So I thought that was pretty profound. I'm not really sure how profound the message was to the other people who I said it to, but again, maybe I'm the wrong person to be saying it to. But my sense is, and it's not necessarily always based on absolute science. My sense is that things are progressing a lot faster than even we are aware that they are, and that's why I think the sort of humans' behavior is usually innately selfish. So to harness that selfishness, we need to point out how important systems are for them, for us, if you like. And that's I suppose that's why I think the ecosystem services or there's various different versions of it, or the natural capital are good places to start. But maybe you have an idea of the journey as to how they're going to progress and where it's going to end in order to be able to bring about a situation where we actually appreciate them for what they are.
Yes, I mean, it's a big question.
I might have brought you back to the dark places there, Glenn. Sorry.
Well, I think the via negativa, I think the journey into the dark has a lot to be said for it. It's where we transform the Furies into the wise characters who will help us along the journey. But the Furies do have to be transformed, and that does require an inward turn, really, a reflexive turn. I think my concern with notions of capital is that if they are primarily economic and they don't recognize other ways of valuing, the accountancy will be really questionable.
I agree. I totally agree. I had a discussion with a student this morning who was giving out about her grade, and she said she gave a great potential solution to the biodiversity crisis, talking about basically economic instruments. And I said, you've only mentioned one tool there. So there's a whole other thing around value and around appreciation, like all the things that you talked about the arts, all these other things that I mean, it only scratched the surface of it, but maybe it's a reflection of the students that we're producing here, that they go, if I provide an economic solution, that's good enough for me to get a very good grade in terms of things. So that's not really. So I had a good discussion with her for about 15 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. And she was like, she said, I just think it was a bit harsh for you to ask us to come up with a solution in 200 words for something, you know, and I came up with this. And I said, the thing about it is, hopefully in 5 years, you'll remember this discussion. You mightn't remember what the one that you got the first. So I think I totally agree. There's so much more to, like, price and value aren't the same thing at all.
Yes, and I suspect here we've got to recognize just how hard it is to unlearn a lot of the stuff that gets learned, because and I think this is part of the challenge of working with medics, is that the framing that usually establishes sufficiency for a medic is focused on the patient. And it demonstrates sufficiency because what matters is in the frame. And what we're asking people to do is kind of not just widen the frame, but actually change the lenses within their own attentional practices. And I don't, and this isn't just about vision, because it's really unfortunate that we're you know, primarily a visual species. You know, we don't really understand reality because we're dependent on the primacy of vision. You know, we don't bring in particularly smell, which is much more holistic in its approach. We don't, you know, we have this challenge, I think, with supporting people in becoming systems thinkers, where systems thinkers is not about widening the frame and seeing a bit more of the whole. It's actually about changing what you look at within any frame, and actually seeing the processes and seeing the poetry. For me, there's a need for poetics here, whether this be eco-poetics or geopoetics. Arguably, I think it needs to be ontopoetics, where what we see is different. And this is what I think Bayrak Malafe talks about beautifully when you know, he calls for ontological mutiny, so that what we actually think is real becomes even closer to that reality. It's not this assumed framing that we've inherited from modernity. There's something more ecological there, and ecological in a richer sense, because our anthropocentric lenses don't really see things ecologically. They see things in a primarily utilitarian way.